On behalf of the Johnstown Area Heritage Association and the Cambria County Library, I'd like to welcome you tonight. We're incredibly excited to have such a huge turnout. There are 250 of us registered and most of us are in attendance already, so we're in for a real treat. I'd like to start with introducing myself. I'm Deb Wintersheet. I'm JAHA's Development Director and Head of Membership. Everyone who registered should have received an email from me a couple of hours ago with details on how you have a chance to win an autographed copy of Russell Shorto's Smalltime, A Story of My Family and the Mob. If you have any questions, feel free to email me later. If you don't see an email, check your spam or junk mail, please. And if you have any questions for Russell as you're listening tonight, you can type your question on the control panel, and our online moderator, Larissa Duncan from the Cambria County Library, will share as many as possible with him towards the end of our program tonight. And now let me introduce you to JAHA's president and our host for this evening, Richard Burkert.
Thank you, Deb. I really appreciate how you managed to include a small game of chance in this evening's discussion, so which is totally appropriate.
We did the best we could.
We're just delighted to have with us, of course, Russell Shorto, an author and historian with deep Johnstown roots, graduate of Westmont Hilltop High School. He's, at least till now, probably best known for the book, The Island at the Center of the World, that traces New York City's Dutch origins. Just recently, his new book, Smalltime, A Story of My Family and the Mob, has come out earlier this month. In Johnstown, there of course have been, rumors about organized crime for a long time, and with the publication of this book, despite COVID, the town seems to be buzzing with this amazing and fascinating story. And Russell, I was really surprised at the number of people I knew or I know who were your informants in this book. It's really delightful and very personal in a lot of different ways. Your grandfather and namesake, Russell Shorto, ran numbers, managed pinball and sports betting operations with his mafia partner and brother-in-law, little Joe Regino, from the end of World War II into the 1960s. This operation peaked fairly quickly. Could you describe this gambling network that they maintained for so many years in Johnstown? Some of how much has permeated everyone's lives?
Okay, well, you're jumping right into the middle of it, Richard. Before I do that, let me say thank you to you and to JAHA and the Cambria County Library for hosting this and for helping me with the research. As you know, I spent a lot of time at your facilities and also at the library downtown. And I just want to say, anybody who's interested, I became a big believer in family history while working on this book. And these are two really good resources. You can do a lot of interesting digging into your family and into the town. Just one quick example, the local history section of the library downtown has city directories, and a lot of people don't even know what a city directory was, but every town used to publish them, and it was like a phone book, but it listed things by address rather than by last name. So you could look up the address of the house you live in now, or if you knew where your parents or grandparents or whoever it was lived at a time in the past, you could look it up for 1957 or 1962 or whatever year, and you'll see there who was living there, who all was living in the house, who the neighbors were, and you begin to be able to kind of recreate that neighborhood from your past or your family's past.
That's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and just gone back a little bit. This was difficult research. I remember when you told me a couple of years ago that you're writing a story about crime in Johnstown, and your grandfather, your namesake, was he was a remote sort of person. And you had to do research your family, as you're suggesting, by actually using newspapers and county records, and the way you would normally research an historical person. You went back and did that work with your grandfather, and then you lucked, and you need to tell people about your group of elderly gentlemen you'd meet in Panera. This is a delightful story.
Yeah, the reason I got into this was Frank Filia, who I'll bet a lot of people who are on this call know personally. Frank is my mother's cousin, and so there's a lot of things I kind of want to say at once, but Frank is the one who got me into it, and he encouraged me to do it. And when he first piqued my interest, I was skeptical because, as you say, I write nonfiction. I don't make stuff up, and I knew that those guys back then didn't keep notebooks. So what am I gonna base this on? But Frank eventually said, I'll come and I'll help you out. And so he had me meet him at Panera Bread up opposite what is that place? TJ Maxx. And so I thought we were just going to sit there and he was going to tell me some stories. And I turned on my recorder and he started talking. Then one guy comes up who knows him, and another guy and another. He'd put out the word. So soon there was like 7 or 8 guys around us. And 4 hours later, I turned off the recorder. So they were all, and what I realized is my grandfather, that generation, those guys are gone. But Frank and these guys who are still here, most of them, many of them, they were the young guys who looked up to them and admired them, and really admired them. I mean, this is, maybe we can get into this, but there's a sense in which people in town knew Russ and Joe and what they were doing, and they participated. It was basically just playing the numbers and pinball machines and things like that. And they were fixtures in the town, and everybody was aware of it and what they were doing. So Frank and his gang looked up to them, and they then sat down with me and gave me all these stories, which was step one. It was like, okay, there's a lot of stories here. But then step 2 and 3 and 4 was, how am I going to reinforce that? I mean, because people have stories that are 50, 60 years old. I'm not going to just trust that that's not, something that the mind has kind of embellished. So then I did the work of filing for FBI Freedom of Information Act documents, looking at police records, county courthouse records, newspapers. That's what I was doing at JAHA. There used to be a great weekly called the Johnstown Observer, which you could see that the Observer printed a lot of gossip, and they'd be printing something weeks before it would show up in the Tribune, as like an official news story. They would start whispering about something that was going on in town. So that's a great way to kind of get what was going on. And that would often, what the Observer was printing would be, almost word for word, something that these guys were telling me from decades later, So that was a good way to kind of ground my research.
Returning then to that, their operation, they had 1,000 pinball ball machines they were betting on. They had, you estimate that something like 50% of Johnstown residents played, gambled every day, and it was illegal at that time. There's sports betting, and your grandfather's operation employed 100 people. It was a big operation.
Yeah, and this is, what was going on in Johnstown was going on in Altoona, it was going on in Scranton, in Schenectady, New York, and in Fresno, California, and Amarillo, Texas. The one thing that attracted me about this story is this was just American life. It wasn't just, and it was really different. What was going on in places like Johnstown was really different from what was going on in New York and Chicago. There was like drugs and murder, and in small towns like Johnstown, it was basically gambling, which was illegal. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think now how this heavy blanket of morality that was on society, it was seen as so wrong that you would engage in gambling, and yet everybody seemed to want to do it. And part of the reason was, I think there's an interesting correlation that you would probably be able to make between the rise of televisions in American households and the decline of this kind of activity. In 55% of American households had TVs. By 1960, 90% did. And that was their heyday. You know, they were making, and so what people did before they had TVs, you know, you went out, you hung out, you went to a cafe, to a bar, to pool halls. I mean, the guys told me there were something like 6 pool halls in that like 2-block stretch of Main Street downtown. And you hung out and you gambled a little bit, and it was a way to pass the time. That's what people were doing. So this, you know, it was a pretty big operation. And as I said before, it was really in the open. There were, you know, somebody said about 100 people employed. That means most of those people were, you know, after work, you would run numbers for a couple of hours or something like that. It wasn't necessarily a full-time job for everybody, but there were, you know, there were myriad activities, myriad ways to take part in games of chance.
It was a more sociable age too. You know, all the ethnic social clubs flourished at that period too. Well, let's step back into your great-grandfather, Anthony Shorto, immigrated from Sicily and went first to Punxsutawney, where he worked as a coal miner. They made their way to Johnstown. He sent for a woman who became his, I suppose, wife. And he's actually killed. He returns to Sicily and is murdered. And it's a period of like extreme discrimination against Italians. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was really active in Johnstown, Cambria, and Blair, Altoona had the highest per capita Klan membership of anywhere in the United City in the United States.
Is that right? I know that.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So the KKK, a lot of that's not focused just on African Americans. It's focused against Italians, Catholics, and crime's really kind of a way that immigrant groups found to get ahead. And so when your great-grandfather Anthony dies, his widow, your great-great-grandmother Anna Maria, starts bootlegging. And your grandfather Russell starts putting, selling Coke bottles full of home brew. So prohibition is what really started the, crime in Johnstown, as I understand it.
Well, I don't know if it started crime. I mean, crime is everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
It's the beginning, I think. It's generally seen to be the beginning of organized crime in the form of the mob, the official. And what was going on in Johnstown was the same thing that was going on in so many other places. And I was amazed when I really started to explore it, how much discrimination there was against Southern Italians in the early 20th century. And first of all, I mean, if you think about it, America has this great need for workers to do work that Americans didn't want to do. And it was 2 things. It was either on plantations because you couldn't use slaves anymore, they were freed, or it was in coal mines, which was also brutally dangerous work. So they put out the word. At the same time, in Italy, they had unified. For the first time, Italy unified. And it was an interesting thing. Right after the Civil War in the US, Italy becomes a nation. And when that happened, Northern Italians had always been very prejudiced against Southern Italians. And they made life even worse for them then. So there's this extreme poverty in Southern Italy. All these employers in America find out about that, and suddenly you see notices, posters on streets in southern Italian towns and in Sicily, where my ancestors are from, advertising for work, saying, "Come, it'll be legal and you can work here." And so my great grandfather, his name was Antonino Shorto, saw one of these ads and got on a ship and came, and I think most of them at that time wanted to, they thought they would go work for a year, save up money and come back. And, it was like seasonal work, what a lot of migrants do now. That's the way they looked at it. But what he did instead, he started, as you said, he got to Punxsutawney and worked for a company, and then sent for, I think I have to say, his girlfriend, because he already had a wife in Sicily. But he sends for this girl who he knew obviously in the town, and she comes, and they are listed separately in Punxsutawney. Then when they move to Johnstown, they suddenly become Tony and Mary Shorto. That's how they show up in the census. So they took on kind of a new identity. And again, I think a lot of people did this. A lot of people, I mean, back then, if you were going from across the ocean and setting up a household here, it was a new life, and you could set up a new life for yourself. So that's what they did. And it was a time when in all over the country, including Johnstown, there was a huge amount of discrimination against these very people, because there were so many of them. 4 million people came from southern Italy. So now Americans are really annoyed about this. And that is how the KKK comes back to life. It had been founded after the Civil War as opposed to blacks, opposed to these freed blacks. But it had completely died out. But it came back to life around 1920, particularly opposed to Southern Italians and Irish to some extent, and other immigrants. And it was really the Catholic immigrants and the Catholic Church. And the third group was sort of big city elites that they were against. So the KKK and Prohibition was a factor in that too. Prohibition was also aimed at these groups because it was thought that Italians, they had their wine as part of their culture, and the Irish had whiskey as part of their culture, and this was somehow, we were gonna purify America. All right, so then you have people like my great grandparents, and there are a lot of people maybe on this call and all around the country who can relate to this in their families, who come to America and they're doing this work and they're very restricted. They can only live in certain company towns, and they're told what they can do, where they can spend their money. The next generation, though, they're kids. They have kids, and the kids go to American schools, and they learn to admire America. They learn about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They learn about the great figures of American capitalism, of business, like Henry Ford and John Jacob Astor and Carnegie and Mellon. And these guys, pretty much those robber barons, they kind of did what they wanted. They got ahead by paying off politicians, by organizing society to their liking, so they could make money at it. So these young immigrant children come of age admiring that, but also not being allowed to participate in this society. So Prohibition is there, and here is this job opportunity. They can start. So that's what happened. So in neighborhoods, typically there'd be a guy, like an Italian guy in the neighborhood, who would organize people, and he'd organize women, and often it was single mothers, like my great grandmother, and organize them, say, you set up a still here, and whatever, he'd make out financial arrangements. I'll give you money to set it up, and then you can keep a percentage of it. So that's how she gets by, and then that's how my grandfather, as a kid, really, even before he was a teenager, starts to understand how you get by in America. So he's selling hooch, he's selling moonshine on the streets. By the end of Prohibition, like lots of others all over the country, he has now been trained by local guys in gambling, and he starts running after Prohibition ends. That's what the mob formed. It made gambling their next income stream. And so he sets up a gambling operation.
You describe how several of these people, your grandfather, Joe Regino, Mike Galena, were all masters. They practiced for hours how to cheat at dice, how to deal off the bottom of deck of cards, and they were really masterful con men. It was a fundamental skill to winning at gambling.
Well, I would. They weren't all like that. There were kind of two different types. There were ones who were just organized people who were running a business, say a gambling enterprise, and then there were people who were card sharps, who were cheats. And I've learned that those are two different. Often they overlap, but often they're two different things, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. They invent institutions like the GI Bank, and they have their headquarters at City Cigar, a couple doors away from City Hall. And can you maybe describe what City Cigar, what that experience was like? And it was a very busy place, and there were multiple functions, multiple things going on there. And it was a place for people to meet and mix.
Sure. Yeah, it was a social scene, and I tried as I did, and including asking you at JAHA, I've not yet seen a photograph of City Cigar, so I don't know firsthand what it looked like. But I had many people describe it to me, and it was 2 doors from City Hall, and there's still, if you go there, the building beside it was taken down, so the brick wall on the side, you can see still this cigar ad, this big, very colorful cigar ad on it. But you would walk in, and there was a storefront in front, and on the left was a counter that sold cigars and newspapers, and on the right was a little lunch counter. And then there was a door in back, and you went in that door, and there was a very long room that had 10 pool tables and a billiards table and a counter, and the counter had a ticker tape machine that was spitting out sports scores. And it was a hangout. It was mostly a hangout for a little bit more of a well-to-do client, people from City Hall, for example, would hang out there. And then there were other pool halls that, elsewhere in town that were, ones by the Millgate were more kind of working class.
You hook up with the guy, Mike Galena, who I've met at the YMCA off late, and he's a fascinating character in your book. He's Russell Shorto's right-hand man, and he comes out as looking like a Robin Hood figure. He's a teenager, and he catches everyone's attention because every day, I guess, there was a big train of coal that went into the Franklin Works of Bethlehem Steel, and Galena pours gasoline on the ties and lights the railroad, the Continental Black Railroad, on fire, and it stops, and almost on cue, everyone from Woodville runs out with their baskets and buckets to steal coal, because it was still the Depression. They were hungry, they were cold. Yeah, talk a little bit about Mike. I mean, he's fearless. And he worked for a long time.
Yeah, well, okay, the backstory is I had a very hard time trying to get a handle on Russ, my grandfather, because he was a very quiet, very private guy. And everybody I talked to said, Russ, what was he like? Very quiet. Okay, well, how do I bring him to life? And then finally Frank said, you know what, I'm going to introduce you to a guy. And he said, nobody knew Russ like Mike. So Frank called Mike, and I guess he had called him before and, told him what I was doing. And so Mike said, okay, come on over. And Mike, he died a few years ago. He was a terrific guy, really fun, and I considered him a friend. And it turned out, was my grandfather's protege. They came up together. They were trained by the same guys in the neighborhood. He grew up admiring my grandfather and worked with him. He described this amazing situation during the war, during World War II, where to get the line, the betting line on baseball games, they got the line from Pittsburgh. They had the best minds, I guess. I figure it was very, if you're offering bets, you have to know where to set the line. Otherwise, the house is going to lose money, and the house can't lose money. There was I think there was some sort of strife between Johnstown and Pittsburgh. Somehow communications were broken. They weren't getting the line. So it was Russ's job then to set the line. And so Mike described how the two of them, they had on Market Street, there was a building there where they had a club, the Melody Lounge. And above that, they had some rooms that they rented out. And so they moved into these rooms. And for the baseball season, Mike told me, Russ took him, he was a kid, and he took him up there, and they both slept in there. And they would have to, they would work on, with everybody told me that Russ was an amazing natural mathematician. He could just look at a column of numbers and just tell you the sum. So just with pencil and paper, figuring out, doing the math on starting pitcher statistics and all that, and setting the line. And so they bonded over this experience. And for the rest of his life, I mean, my grandfather, a lot of people have said a lot of bad things about him. But Mike, the first time I met him, he said to me, "You heard a lot of bad things about your grandfather. I tell you right now, you just put that in the ash can." That's what he said. Just put it in the ash can. Nobody knew us like I did. So he proceeded, and I think we had 11 or 12 face-to-face sessions, just sitting in his kitchen, and his wife Eleanor, would lay out a platter or make us coffee or something. And just talking about back then and what it was like. And he had this great inside sense of how it ran.
One of the things I thought was really endearing about the group that your grandfather was the center of, they weren't a flashy bunch in Johnstown, at least. There was a no Cadillacs rule. You couldn't show your wealth. Now you could go to Atlantic City or Florida and live as lavishly as you want, but that wouldn't work in Johnstown. And
it's not just Johnstown. I just yesterday I did a podcast called Gangland Wire about a podcast for people who are interested in mob stuff, and the guy who hosts it is a former crime reporter from Kansas City. And he told me it was exactly the same thing in Kansas City. You didn't wear flashy suits, you didn't drive Cadillacs, but when you went out of town, when you went on vacation, then you could live it up.
The other amusing part of this is that stuff would just show up at the door. Televisions, boxes of chewing gum, dresses for your grandmother. And you might explain how that all happened.
So I said before that there were sort of two sides to this which overlap but didn't necessarily. One is, running this kind of operation was like running a business, so you were just running, you had to have an accountant, and you had to, you were running your numbers game and all these things. But then there was, my grandfather also was a card sharp, and he loved to win at cards, and he would get involved in these very big time games. And my dad said that he remembered being a kid, and a couple hours before the game, my grandfather would be sitting at the dining room table practicing, like dealing the second card and dealing off the bottom of the deck, like an athlete. He's practicing before a big game. And then he would, win. And these people said that sometimes the pots were like $10,000 or something, which in the 1950s was a lot of money. Some of these people he was playing against were people in town who owned a, department store or clothing store or whatever. And so sometimes he would take the winnings in supplies, in whatever they had. And he described, and my dad said, his dad would tell his mom, okay, go down to the, women's clothing store and just get whatever you want. and she'd walk around in the aisles, and the manager would be putting these dresses over his arm, and and that's how he would get, or else, as you say, they, boxes of stuff would just show up on the porch. So that was, his winnings.
This is, I wanted to ask you about the Shangri-La. That was, I think, rumored for years to have mob connections. I didn't know that it was the Heidelberg. And actually, I had read that was where the German Bund met in the 1930s. But the mob acquires this, and it later becomes Russell Shorto's headquarters after it's closed City Cigar.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a neat story.
Yeah, that's not quite right. He was never, I think, an owner in Shangri-La.
Right.
After he left the mob, he started a place in Richland called the Jockey Club.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
That was his headquarters. But Shangri-La was where they, they would have big parties and big weddings, and people would go there regularly for fancy dinners, and it was that kind of place.
The 1950s are interesting for Johnstown because really it was the early 1950s when the average steel worker rose out of poverty for the first time. It could become middle class. Yeah. And I think a lot of people look back at those times, and I think this probably even includes the gambling. These were the good times for Johnstown. Johnstown was at its peak. Everybody was working. There was money. And again, that high level of sociability. So your book's got a lot of interaction, and the town's buzzing. It's really an active place to be.
And you probably know more about this than I do, but that's something that I really tried hard to research and to recreate, because everybody who was around at that time, in the early 50s especially, that they have such memories of that. And they describe, because now what's the population of Johnstown? It's under 20,000, right?
Yeah, right. It's 19 some.
And then it was like 60,000. So it was more than 3 times. And everybody described Main Street on a Saturday night, just alive with people, even after midnight, people crawling. And right across the street from City Hall, that corner there where that little park was called Wolves Corner. So that's where guys like hang out. And, of course, in the days before cell phones and all that, you're like, how are you going to meet up with someone? Well, you knew they was going to just be hanging out at Wolves Corner. And so somebody would come and pick them up and take them wherever. And so, and as you say, I think the real lifeblood of the town was the fact that a blue collar worker, somebody working in the steel mill, could make enough to have a wife and kids and buy a house and buy a car and, start buying televisions and nice furniture. And now that just seems almost far-fetched, which is astounding. But that was, in a way, I think a lot of people still have in their minds, that was the American dream. We had it. Where did it go?
We had it. Where did it go? Exactly. There is a real visceral excitement about just how lively Johnstown was in that period. You captured it. The organized crime in Johnstown had a lot of political influence as well, too. You trace how John Torquato, an Italian, became chairman of the Cambria County Democratic Party. And, one of the reasons that crime could function right out in the open is because whatever party was in control of the county, the mob would remit 5% of their take, whoever controlled the town. And funds went to the mayor, police, district attorney, judges. Occasionally, around election time, they'd have to make make some arrests. So they'd call in advance, they'd find someone to take the fall. So this was an elaborate system until it broke down.
It was an elaborate system, and once again, I have to say, it was the same all across the country. And this, one of the striking things to me when I started researching organized crime in America, the classic textbook is called Organized Crime. It's written by a guy named Howard Abedinsky, and he points out how when these figures like my grandfather, that era, when they were coming of age, they admired those leaders of capitalism and they were copying them. And that's what they did. They bribed politicians. So that's what these guys did. In Johnstown, they were doing what they did in Washington, which was paying off the politician. And then everybody, things were quite in the open. I mean, it's hard to fathom, but everybody, like when I talk to people in town, when I was interviewing people, they didn't have to have been associated in any direct way with this. If they're over 75 years old or something, they knew all this. They knew everything that was going on. They knew City Cigar. They knew the Clinton Street pool room, and how these things were connected. And I mean, everybody knew it, and it was okay, because I think it was just. I mean, now we have so many forms of entertainment. We don't even know what to do with all of it. We can't even, Netflix and all that, you didn't have it then. And these guys, they were part of the community. They provided entertainment, and everybody accepted that. And there was a little, it was, it sounds kind of dark and fishy if you say, oh, they paid off the authorities. That was just, I don't think they were making them rich or anything. It was just you greasing the wheels so you can get on.
Then it all starts falling apart in 1960. And, February of 1960, Pippi DeValco gets murdered. And there's a lot of fallout. And that's when they lost control of the politicians. George Water, the new reform mayor. There's a new county district attorney who refused bribes and started police raids. Why don't you talk about Pippi DeValco and you kind of tentatively had provided at least a theory on who murdered him, and some closure on that story.
Okay, well, first of all, when I was sitting down with, when I first sat down with Frank and the guys at Panera Bread, one by one, people would say to me, you know about Pippi, right? You've heard the story of Pippi? And so I heard it many times. And at first I thought, well, it's interesting just because if you're writing about this kind of stuff, here's a murder that happened. And by the way, it's an unsolved murder. It's never even went to trial or anything. But as I got further into it, I realized that, as you say, it had this central role in things. And the reason it did is what I was just saying, that like Altoona and here in Cumberland and all over the country, all this stuff was in the open. It was kind of light in these small towns. People weren't there weren't murders going on. People weren't like with machine guns gunning guys down in the street or anything. And then this murder happens, and Pippi DeFalco was a bookie who booked sports, and sometimes he worked for the guys, for my grandfather, and sometimes he was on his own, and sometimes apparently he would work for the boys in other places, like in Greensburg. And apparently that when you did that, it caused problems, so nobody liked that. There was always kind of this uneasy, all right, that's your territory and this is my territory, but there was always a lot of friction around that. So one night in February 1960, Pippi goes missing. His body's not found until April. So the Johnstown Observer is the first place you see. A couple of days later, this bookie, Pippi DeFalco, hasn't appeared. His car is still parked. He parked his car on Vine Street, right on the other side of the Holiday Inn, and it was still there, And so everybody's like, "Well, where's Pippi? What's going on here?" And a few days later, there's more, and now people are starting to get alarmed, and then they start to openly say, "Wait, Pippi was connected to the guys and to what was going on, you know? So is that an explanation for what happened to Pippi? The whole backstory and the reason why I think this kind of brought about the change in town is that this coincided with JFK coming into the White House. He brought his brother, Bobby Kennedy, in as Attorney General. He came in with this mandate, you know, throughout the 1950s. In the beginning of the 50s, you had J. Edgar Hoover running the FBI saying, there's no such thing as organized crime. There's no such thing as a mob that's all over the country that's connected and all that. Then in 1957, there's this meeting of mob bosses that is busted by the feds, and they have to admit, okay, there is this organized crime thing. So from that time until Kennedy comes into power, the government, the federal government, is spending more and more focus on this problem. So now Kennedy comes in, and Bobby Kennedy, you have a remarkable situation where the Attorney General in Washington is communicating with the mayor of Johnstown, saying, hey, what is this of a bookie? And these guys, so suddenly you have FBI guys in town, you know, kind of swarming all over the place. And then all the guys, my grandfather and all the rest of them, are suddenly scared, because now, you know, the reason they had been allowed to operate was precisely because what they were doing was very gentle. You know, if they had started murdering people 10 years before, I think a small town couldn't sustain that. You know, you wouldn't put up with it. The police and then the state police, everybody would be involved. So now that there was this murder that happened at the same time that there was this crackdown at the federal level, that's what spelled the beginning of the end.
Just to conclude this portion of our discussion, this book is intensely personal. A lot of material about, particularly your father, Tony, who when it's confusing, but then when you really ferret out the details, Russell had his father prevented him from entering, organized crime, and your father's really attracted by that. He's even a member as a teenager. He joins the Cat Gang, which I know is a great name for a gang. But it's amazing that when it was all said and done, Russell had barred him from his profession.
Yeah,
and again, I think it was all this. I mean, you went on the line with this book, really providing a lot of family information and sharing it, and it really enriches the book. But again, talk a little bit about your dad.
Well, my dad, when I first got into this and decided, all right, I think I'm going to do this. My dad, who was my grandfather's oldest son, is probably the person who was most affected by all of that. And I asked him if he would be willing to do this with me, to explore this with me. And he said yes. My dad has always been a very open person. He'd like to say, you're only as sick as your secrets. And so it became this wonderful, really wonderful father-son adventure where, I'd come into town and hang out at my parents' house, and we'd start with both my parents. We'd start talking about the old days and certain names and events, and a name would come up, and I'd say I'd never heard of that person. My dad'd say, "Oh, you haven't?" And he'd call the guy up, and he'd say, "Are you around? We're coming over." So we'd go over, and just simple stuff like that, and we'd an hour or two there, and there's another whole story, another window onto things, so it was. My dad died near the end of my work on the book. And so it was, I feel very fortunate that this became a real bonding experience, that we were able to spend this much time together doing something so meaningful, to both of us.
It's a really insightful book, and it's a model for family history on a really deep level. So congratulations. I wanted to take a little bit of time to do a reading portion here.
Right.
And if you would, share with us the beginning of your Smalltime.
Yeah, I'll just read the first couple of pages. Chapter 1 is called The Setup. It started one evening when I was home for the holidays. Picture a too warm living room so crammed with relatives that people's limbs are overlapping. A day or two after Christmas, a cloudy gray night sky, snow starting to fall. I'm a writer of narrative history, by the way, someone who makes a living telling nonfiction stories about the past. So in terms of subject matter, you might think this one would have been obvious to me long ago. It was not. Anyway, the TV is blaring from one corner of my parents' living room. The tree is stuffed into another. A tray of cookies is going around. And somebody mentions that Frankie is in town. Who's Frankie? Your mother's cousin, Frankie Filia. I'd met him once or twice. I knew he was a jazz singer who had left town a lifetime ago for Las Vegas, that he had a long career there, playing gigs and tending bar and casinos. After 5 decades of fingering the thick strings of the stand-up bass, crooning for an endless succession of smoky rooms, he'd decided to retire and come home. An hour later, a couple of carloads of us figure we'll head down to the lounge where Frankie now plays once a week in a local geriatric combo. Stepping from the snowy night into a dark room, confronted by the dank smell of all old bars, and there's Frank, luridly lit on the makeshift stage, a little guy in his late 70s, roundish body flanked by the shapely neck of the bass. He puts a hand over his eyes to peer at the doorway, smiles as he sees us, distant relations, here to partake of what he's offering. We pile in, order drinks, stand there with our big coats on, ranged around like Easter Island statues. Frank's got a nice, foggy, breezy voice, the kind that invites you to take a ride with him. Volare, fly me to the moon. At a break in the set, there are kisses, greetings. We're standing in a circle, and at some point, Frank looks across at me and wags a finger. Russell, I've been wanting to talk to you. You're a writer. What are we going to do about the story? What story? In the middle of asking, the answer is right there, fully formed in my mind. I feel a need to declare here that I had a normal small-town America childhood, meaning that it was weird or quaint in all the standard ways. Going on Sunday drives as a family, playing strip poker with hushed friends in somebody's parents' basement, whatever. There was an element of Italian-American self-awareness, but it was mostly limited to food and emotiveness. Long conversations about spaghetti sauce and aunts who kissed you on the lips. Those were the ways we were Italian. Frank shakes his head in exasperation. What story? Your grandfather, the mob. I'll leave it there.
Wow. This is a real gift to Johnstown. We thank you so much for the book and for joining this evening. We're going to open this up for some questions now.
Hi there. Okay, I'm trying to turn my, I've got the perfect question to start off with. Diane asks, has Frank read the book yet? And if yes, what is his impression?
Yeah, I gave it to Frank in draft. He was one of the people I sent it to. And then I waited a good while and then I called and said, so what do you think? And he'd read half of it, and then I called him later and he'd read more. But I think Frank, Dave Souter in the Tribune Democrat quoted Frank in the piece that he did a couple weeks ago, and Frank seems to like the book.
That's good news.
Yeah.
All right. So Joyce asks, you briefly touched on that other ethnic groups were involved in mob activity. Can you speak to whether they had their own structured mob and how they interacted with the group you write about?
If you're talking about in Johnstown, I heard people, this is just, I haven't documented it, but by the way, when people are telling me stories, they would say something like, oh, well, there was like kind of a Polish mob or something in town. And I remember someone telling me that I think a lot of Poles worked at the telephone company on poles, funnily enough. That was the way they would actually tap phone lines. So I have that story. Someone sent me, since the book came out, I'm getting emails from everywhere. And there are so many people all over the country who are either from Johnstown or their parents are or their grandparents were, who grew up hearing stories about Johnstown. And so I'm getting emails of this extended Johnstown family. And somebody just emailed me and said, oh, I've got all this information about the Hispanic mob in Johnstown. And I didn't know anything about the Hispanic mob. So yeah, I think, again, I think it goes back to discriminated groups, and you band together and you form your own kind of society and your own way to get ahead.
Well, very good. Yeah, well, that Richard talks about that all the time with Cambria City. Diane asks, what do your children think about what you've discovered in your research?
They've been with me on this journey in different ways. My daughter, Eva, is an amazing researcher and editor, and she did a lot of researching with me, and then we would periodically stop and just kind of talk about what we're discovering. Eva and Anna, my other daughter, and Rainier, my stepson, typed up transcripts, because I had hundreds of hours of transcripts. So it's kind of been a family project. So yeah, we've all been discovering this together.
Terrific. Renee asked, did you consult with the DeFalco family prior to writing the book, and how much input did they have on it?
I reached out to them and they didn't reply. I reached out through mutual friends and contacts, and that was fine. I didn't need to, I can certainly understand if they didn't want to be part of this. I respect that. At the same time, it's public history, it's public information. So I or anybody else has a right to write about it, as well as about any other events from 50 or 60 years ago.
Sure. George asked, did you anticipate any threats to you? And have you decided, and a second question from him is, have you decided on the topic of your next book?
Two very different questions.
Yes.
Well, I'm hoping this stuff is well enough in the past that I'm not offending anybody that much that they're gonna worry about me. And I learned a long time. I also, part of the story, I went to the village in Sicily where my great grandparents are from, and we were talking about the mob there. And I asked the people in the town there whether there was still, because the mafia, that's where they're from. And I said, is the mafia a presence here now? And they said, because it's a very poor town, they said, look around, why would the mafia be here? And I think kind of say something similar about Johnstown.
Yeah.
And all those guys are gone. My next book, Richard mentioned that I guess what I'm most known for is my book, The Island at the Center of the World, which is about the Dutch founding of New York. And my next book is going to be kind of a sequel to that. So I'm going safely way back in time now and it will be really focused on the English, when the English took over from the Dutch. So it'll be about that moment in American history.
Okay, sorry. Questions are popping in and I've lost my place. So Teresa asks, did you find it difficult taking family memories or stories and making it into a book as opposed to writing about a famous historical figure or figures?
It's certainly very different. And I guess it's difficult in one way. It was difficult living through, realizing when I was in the hospital, when my dad was dying, that this is part of the story. So that's certainly I've learned. I've since spoken with a number of people who've written memoirs. So this is, I think of this book as history, but also a memoir. And I've learned from people who've written memoirs about that experience and how difficult it is, but also how rewarding it is. You do this for catharsis, for healing, and for, sharing these things with your family.
Richard, this one seems more directed to you. Would it be possible to have a map of the locations in the book or a walking tour?
Old Conemaugh Borough is, there's a major trail going through Old Conemaugh Borough, and I think that could be, help lead to some investment in that area, which, that was that neighborhood has suffered more than just about any neighborhood in Johnstown. And that's either the early period, that was the site of it. I think later on, Russ Russ and his wife moved out to Roxbury, is where you grew up, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, we'll have to think about that. Maybe a different type of historical marker would be the way to go. Yeah. Again, we can go to those.
On paper would be fun.
Yeah, it could be fun. We'll have to get the addresses from the city directory, as Russell was mentioning earlier.
So a gentleman named Bob says he worked at the Shangri-La as a car hop for about a year. Can you talk more about Bonnie the maitre d' and Sam Fashion?
I don't know about Bonnie, but Sam Fashion is definitely a guy who was part of the story.
Yeah.
He came from Altoona. The story that I have is that he was brought in to keep an eye on Russ and Joe, because there was always periods when the different factions kind of distrusted each other. But he ended up settling in town and stayed for a long time. And then he was also apparently a really good cook, and he became the chef there.
Great. So Jacob asks, so you mentioned somebody asked a question and it jumped around on me, sorry. You mentioned organized crime burning the railroad ties to the Franklin Works. Russell, do you know if organized crime aided organized labor when they tried to organize against Bethlehem Steel? Do either of you know the answer to that?
Richard, do you want to take that?
Well, everybody was pretty much Bethlehem. Was a powerful force in the community. So the newspaper, the clergy, just about any third party supported the company against the United Steelworkers. I think that's a really interesting question, though, and I would suspect your organized crime tended to have their sympathy with the working man, so I would suspect so, but I'm not sure how they could express it. Clergy could go into the, get an opinion in the Tribune, and the mayor could arm a citizens posse and give Bethlehem Steel bought rifles for 200 vigilantes. Concretely, I'm not sure how organized crime could respond in that same way with that same force.
If I could just clarify, I think the question began saying that organized crime did that, creating a fire on the tracks on the way to the Franklin plant. It wasn't organized crime. That was that was one kid, one guy, but he had done it kind of in cahoots with people in the neighborhood. And the point is, and this is really a point behind a lot of this story, it was winter and people were cold, and all this coal people watched trundling past every day into the mill, and the mill needed it, but at the same time people were cold. So the idea was stop the train, and then people opened these hoppers and got buckets. They brought buckets with them. So this was just like a neighborhood action to keep themselves warm.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Let's see. Did you learn, Diane D asked, did you learn anything that would be of interest to Johnstowners that you didn't put in the book?
Yeah, of course. But so much ends up on the cutting room floor. But people want general information. Randy Whittle's 2-volume book about Johnstown is just full of, and I met him before he died, and he was a great chronicler of the town. And if you want more just raw history, there's a lot of it that he got from a lot of sources, including, of course, from the paper. He would just did the real legwork, which is real legwork because the Tribune Democrat, unfortunately, is not indexed. A lot of places, you can just type in a word and up pops a story from 1932 or whatever. The Tribune hasn't done that. So you have to actually go through, looking for whatever it is you're looking for.
Dave C. asked, can you talk about other families that participated in these activities aside from the Shortos and the families specifically mentioned in the book?
Yeah, well, I talk about people in the book who were willing to talk to me, and a lot of them were, but I think I'll leave it in the book. I don't want to, you know, I wasn't given license to talk about them on open forums otherwise. So you feel free to read the book.
Diane asked, did your grandfather ever run across Judge O'Kickey?
Yeah, Judge O'Kickey is I mean, his story is an example of something that I didn't bring up in the book, but you know, there are a lot of, but yeah, that connection is part of the larger story.
Diane O asks, and she said the librarians also want to know, and Richard, you may be able to answer this. Do you know where we family researchers go to view the Johnstown Observer?
JAHA has print copies of, I think, the entire run of the Observer. They were George Minnow owned that paper last, and they were found in what's now in the second floor offices of what's now Somerset Trust, and were given to JAHA. They've never been microfilmed, and you know that all happened decades ago when they microfilmed newspapers. So yeah, you have to go to JAHA to use them, which Russell did.
And I'll just add that it's unfortunate in a way that they haven't been microfilmed. On the other hand, in those bound volumes that you have, you're just reading the paper. That's such a pleasure. And like reading an old-fashioned print newspaper, you see things that you weren't looking for, it's in the article beside the thing you thought you were looking for, and then you start, you know, following that. So it's it's a nice way to kind of lose yourself in the past.
Paul asked.
Let me just one other thing, that when you're doing that, looking at the Observer from the early 50s, I mean, just the ads. I mean, you can lose yourself in the ads because there's so much for sale locally, and there was so much local business, and you know, it just makes you I don't know, kind of angry almost for, you know, why are we in this situation? Why are towns like Johnstown the way they are now? Why can't we, you know, get that kind of life and economic life that we had back then?
Shannon asked, did you actually know who murdered Pippi?
It's unsolved officially. I spent part of the book exploring it on my own, and you'll have to read the book to
answer
my conclusions and the extent to which I concluded.
Yeah.
Christine asked, what role did the Polish immigrant community play in the gambling that you described?
As I said before, you know, there were different ethnic groups, which I think over the course of starting in the 20s and 30s, those groups really kept to themselves. And then as you get into the 50s, you see this opening up, and everybody is interacting with each other, except they're kind of staying in their same kind of economic class. So the Poles were in there with the Italians and the others.
Well, Paul,
I was curious to note someone I actually knew some time ago, George Zapolich, you know, worked with Russell Shorto, and Michael Strank's cousin, Strank, also was in the kind of the inner circle with Russell.
Yeah.
So it wasn't entirely, you know, one ethnic group, you know, that, you know, even the inner circle.
Correct.
Right. So Paul asks, how did you get Coppola to review your book?
I would like to say, oh, he's an old friend, but that's not true. Simply, my editor, you know, my editor said, wouldn't it be great if we could get a quote from Francis Ford Coppola on the book? And I said, yes. And so he looked, somehow she found an email address for his assistant and wrote and asking, and she got a reply saying, okay, send a copy and he'll take a look. And lo and behold, you know, what I liked about the quote is it was actually longer even than what we printed on the back of the book. But to me, it really reads like a director, written it like the way a director looks at a story, because he picked out certain things like tip seals and the pinball machine, the name Melody Lounge. There were things that, I don't know, seemed cinematic to him, I guess. So yeah, I was very pleased, obviously.
Well, as a follow-up to that, John asks, any thoughts about writing a screenplay for a movie or miniseries? And Larissa added, she sort of hopes that Coppola comes to Johnstown to make the movie.
I do too.
Well, I've been waiting for the Johnstown flood. David McCullough's book was optioned by, so now we have two films in the making.
Is somebody making Johnstown Flood?
Don't know.
We
Right.
just,
Again, it's a long process to, that has a lot to do with finding funding.
Of
And
course.
I met somebody who was well placed, but did several years ago. And that's occurred a couple of times during my time here in Johnstown. So.
Right.
Donald asks, what did you learn that surprised you the most in writing the book? What was your biggest lesson?
I grew up with this sense of my grandfather as this very dark figure. And I grew through the research to have some sympathy for him, because he was, he was of his time, and there were no opportunities. And here was this opportunity that he was given as a kid. And so he just went with it. He was a really smart kid. So he followed it, and I don't think I would do anything differently.
So Lou asks, can you talk about my uncle, Mike the Hatter? Does that name?
No, I don't think I can talk about your uncle Mike the Hatter. I'm sorry.
Mary Lou asks, my grandfather, Michael Cunningham, owned and operated the Alhambra bar in town in the 40s and 50s. Was he involved with your grandfather?
I know that name, and I know the name of the bar. So it's probably in my transcripts of stories that people have told me.
Lisa asked, you noted about your trip to San Pierre Nicito, whoops, sorry, things bounce around on me, in the New York Times article, but you did not hear much about it growing up. Was your family more assimilated and not tied to your background?
Yeah, my family didn't know. I mean, nobody in my immediate family knew anything about, I mean, they knew that my dad's family was from Sicily, but they didn't know any details at all. And when I started exploring this, my dad's cousin's wife said she thought she remembered the name of the town, and she kind of had it, she almost had it. And so I looked it up, and it turned out that that was where, the name Shorto, which was the original name, there were a lot of people in that town with that name. And in fact, when we went there, we did the, in Italian towns in the evening, you do this passeggiata where everybody does kind of a relaxed walk around the block or around the town after dinner. And so we did the passeggiata, and I was introduced to several people with the same name, so that we were figuring, yeah, we're probably cousins or something.
Yeah.
The Croatian club is still active. Were they part of the pinball circle?
I don't know the details on exactly what, who, but I'll tell you, the pinball machines were everywhere. I was amazed to find that pinball at one point, more money was spent on pinball than on the movies. And, so all kinds of bars, clubs, hotel lobbies, cafes, everybody had pinball machines.
Sam asked, so when did you start working on the book? How long did it take from beginning to publishing? Or
I think it was
the book anyway, because publishing.
2013, maybe, when Frank first said, hey, why don't you look into this? Maybe 2012, maybe that long ago. And then, I'm busy, and a couple of years later, I start to think about it more. But then it was, what is that? At least 5 or 6 years of research and writing.
Wow. Poppy asks, were there many Greeks involved?
I heard a lot of stories about Greeks, yes.
And then Marianne asks, how can we find out if our relatives were involved?
Ask your relatives. That's what I did. Ask people, ask the old. I mean, let me just say something about family history. I said before, I'm a big believer in family history, and it is such a meaningful way to understand who you are and to pass things down to your kids. And it was because these people in my family and others were open and wanted to share these stories and realized that this is history. And if they don't share these stories, it's going to die. So find the oldest people and the ones who know the stories in your family and sit down with them and do it. Try to be a little bit systematic about it. Say, no, I really want to do this for a project, whatever the project is. Tape record it and start getting those stories down. And I don't mean to plug my course, but I have an online course called tellyourfamilystory.com, and I give tips on how to interview people, how to interview family members, because the mind isn't like a computer, so you have to kind of trick the mind into getting back to 50 or 60 years ago to remember, like, what did your house smell like? What kind of car did your dad drive? Things like that. And then once you get into that kind of groove, then you start bringing the past back to life.
Just a couple more questions. Michael asks, was there a connection between Johnstown crime and Uniontown crime in Fayette County?
There was connections between, and I'm almost a little, when you say crime, I'm almost a little, I feel kind of defensive because, it was what they were doing would be legal today. There's lotteries and but yeah, there were connections all over the place with Johnstown and Altoona, Johnstown and McKeesport and Braddock and Pittsburgh and New Kensington, the whole region.
All right, I think our last question from Lori is, do you feel your life has been shaped more by place or by your ethnic background?
I never strongly felt that I was, being Italian is so meaningful to me. As I said in that little excerpt, we always made spaghetti sauce on the weekends, and we always ate spaghetti. And I think I have a very open and warm family, so that's an Italian trait, I guess. But other than that, I don't think of myself. I think of myself as American, and I think of myself very much as from Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Well, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both, and I'll leave it, Richard, to you to say goodnight. And thank you very much, Russell.
Thanks.
Well, on behalf of everyone that's joined us, Russell, thank you for the book and thank you for joining us this evening. I think it's this, you've opened up a really interesting story, a window on Johnstown that we all knew was there, but I think you were the only person who was able to unlock this. And yeah, we are grateful and we're excited about it. So again, thanks, and thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Russell.
Thanks a lot. It was fun.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.
And okay, well, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks.
And please come visit us at the library anytime.
Okay, good night, everyone. Good job.
Good night.